The ambulance doors slammed shut behind the paramedics, leaving a sharp echo in the narrow corridor of the emergency department. The smell of antiseptic mixed with cold night air as the stretcher was rolled inside. On it lay a man wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket, his face unshaven, skin grayish, lips cracked. The monitor beeped unevenly, like it couldn't decide whether to keep going or give up. The senior nurse barely glanced at the chart. She sighed loudly, rolled her eyes, and then turned toward the young nurse standing near the nurse's station. The newcomer still wore her uniform stiffly, as if afraid to crease it. Her name badge looked too clean for this place, too new. They brought in a vagrant, the senior nurse said with a crooked smile. Go practice on him. A few staff members snickered. Someone muttered something about wasting time and resources. The young nurse felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she nodded silently. She had learned quickly that answering back only made things worse. Taking a deep breath, she approached the stretcher. Up close, the man looked older than she had first thought. Deep lines cut into his face, not just from age but from hardship. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak under her fingers. As she checked his pupils, she noticed how one reacted more slowly than the other. Her stomach tightened. She reported her findings calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. His blood pressure is dropping. We need labs and imaging. There could be internal bleeding or... The senior nurse waved her off. He's probably drunk or coming down from something. Don't dramatize it. Do the basics. The young nurse bit her lip and continued working. She cleaned his wounds carefully, ignoring the smell of alcohol and street grime, focusing instead on the rhythm of her own breathing. Her instructors' voices echoed in her mind. Observe, don't assume, every patient matters. Minutes passed, then seconds stretched thin as the monitor's beeping grew more erratic. Suddenly the man coughed, his body jerking weakly. His oxygen saturation dropped. That's not normal, the young nurse said louder now. We need a doctor. The senior nurse frowned, irritated. You're panicking. Before she could respond, the man's eyes fluttered open briefly. They were clear, surprisingly so, and filled with confusion. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his head rolled to the side, and the monitor screamed. The young nurse didn't hesitate. She hit the call button and began emergency procedures, hands moving on instinct more than thought. The room shifted into controlled chaos. A doctor rushed in, followed by more staff. Orders were shouted, equipment wheeled closer, gloves snapped into place. As the team worked, the senior nurse stood back, her earlier confidence cracking. The young nurse assisted silently, fully focused, sweat forming at her temples. Every second mattered, and she knew it. After what felt like an eternity, the monitor steadied. The man's breathing evened out under mechanical support. The room exhaled. Later, when the crisis had passed, the doctor reviewed the results. If we'd waited any longer, he said quietly, we would have lost him. No one laughed now. The man was moved to a quiet room. The young nurse stayed with him, checking vitals, adjusting fluids, documenting everything carefully. Exhaustion crept into her bones, but she didn't leave. Something about him pulled at her, a sense that this wasn't just another patient. Hours later, just before dawn, he stirred again. This time his eyes opened fully. He looked around, disoriented, then focused on her face. You stayed, he whispered, his voice rough but steady. She nodded. You're safe. Try not to talk too much. He managed a faint smile. Most don't. She didn't know what to say to that, so she simply adjusted his pillow. After a pause, he spoke again. They called me a vagrant, didn't they? She hesitated, then answered honestly. Some people made assumptions. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. I used to work in a place like this. Long time ago. That caught her attention. You were medical staff. Administrator, he replied. Before life changed. Over the next hours, fragments of his story emerged. A failed partnership. A betrayal. Years spent trying to fight it, then years spent surviving instead. He had kept his documents hidden, afraid they'd be stolen. Now, with trembling hands, he asked her to retrieve a worn wallet from his belongings. Inside was an old ID, faded but unmistakable. The name matched one the hospital staff knew well, one still mentioned in board meetings and annual reports. Her breath caught. When management arrived later that morning, summoned quietly by the doctor, the atmosphere shifted again. The man spoke calmly, without anger, recounting the night, the dismissive words, the delay that nearly cost him his life. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The senior nurse stood rigid, color draining from her face. Her earlier jokes now sounded cruel even in memory. "I don't want revenge," the man said finally. "I want standards. And I want to thank the one person here who remembered them." He looked at the young nurse. The decision came quickly. An internal review was opened. Protocols were reinforced. The senior nurse was reassigned pending further evaluation. No one said the word punishment, but everyone understood. For the young nurse, the recognition felt unreal. She hadn't acted for praise. She had simply done what she believed was right. Still, when the head of the department thanked her personally, something inside her settled. As she walked out of the hospital that morning, the sky pale with early light, she felt tired, but steady. The laughter, the humiliation, the fear, all of it felt distant now. She knew there would be other nights like this, other tests of her resolve. But she also knew something else. No matter who lay on the stretcher, no matter what names people used, she would see a patient first. And sometimes, that would make all the difference. The ambulance arrived just before midnight, its siren cutting through the winter air like a tired scream. The automatic doors of the emergency department slid open, letting in a gust of cold along with the stretcher. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, revealing a man wrapped in a filthy blanket, his boots mismatched, his clothes soaked with melted snow and something darker that smelled of old blood and alcohol. Male, approximately 55, one of the paramedics reported quickly. Found unconscious near the railway station. Hypothermia, head trauma, possible internal bleeding. Vitals unstable. The senior nurse barely looked up from the computer. She had worked this shift for years and wore her authority like armor. Her lips tightened as her eyes skimmed the patient's appearance. "Another one," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The young nurse stood a few steps away, holding a clipboard with hands that still felt too small for the responsibility they carried. Her uniform was freshly pressed, her hair neatly tied back, but her eyes betrayed a mix of fear and determination. This was only her third week on the job. The senior nurse turned to her with a thin smile. They brought in a vagrant. "Go practice." A couple of orderlies exchanged amused glances. Someone chuckled quietly. The word, practice, hung in the air like an insult disguised as permission. The young nurse swallowed. She had learned quickly that protests only earned sharper ridicule. Without a word, she moved toward the stretcher. Up close, the man looked worse. His face was swollen on one side, a dried streak of blood trailing into his beard. His skin was cold to the touch, almost waxy. She slipped on gloves, checking his pulse, counting silently. Too weak. Too fast. As she lifted his eyelids to check pupil response, she noticed something odd. One pupil reacted sluggishly. Her training kicked in, pushing aside her nerves. She reported her findings carefully. Unequal pupils. Low blood pressure. "We should order a CT and full labs." The senior nurse snorted. "He probably fell drunk. We don't have time to babysit every bum dragged in off the street." The young nurse felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't back down. "It could be a subdural hematoma. We need to rule it out." "Do what I told you," the senior nurse snapped. "Basics only." So she did the basics, but she did them thoroughly. She cleaned his wounds, her movements gentle, almost reverent. She adjusted the oxygen mask, listening to his breathing, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Every so often, she glanced at the monitor, unease growing with each irregular beep. Minutes passed. Then the beeping changed. Faster. Sharper. She checked again. Oxygen saturation dropping. "His condition is worsening," she said, louder now. "We need a doctor." The senior nurse didn't even turn around. "Stop overreacting." The man suddenly stirred. His fingers twitched, then his eyes fluttered open for a brief second. They were clear, unexpectedly so, and full of confusion. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but before any sound came out, his body went limp. The monitor shrieked. The young nurse reacted instantly. She pressed the emergency button and began the protocol she had practiced countless times in simulations. Her hands moved with surprising steadiness as adrenaline drowned out fear. Code blue. Someone shouted. The room filled with people. A doctor rushed in, barking orders. Equipment was wheeled closer. The senior nurse stepped back, suddenly silent. Who was monitoring him? The doctor demanded. I was, the young nurse answered, her voice tight but firm. What happened? He deteriorated rapidly. I warned. Save it. Let's work. They worked hard. Chest compressions. Oxygen. Medication. Time stretched and folded in on itself. Sweat trickled down the young nurse's back, but she didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't look away. Finally, the monitor steadied. A fragile rhythm returned. A collective breath was released. Later, in the quieter aftermath, the doctor reviewed the scans and lab results. His expression darkened. She was right, he said flatly. Internal bleeding. Another 20 minutes and we'd be filling out a death certificate. No one replied. The senior nurse stared at the floor. The patient was transferred to a monitored room. The young nurse volunteered to stay with him. No one objected. The hours before dawn were long and hushed. Machines hummed softly. The young nurse checked vitals, adjusted IV lines, wrote notes with meticulous care. Fatigue tugged at her eyelids, but she refused to sit. Sometime near morning, the man stirred again. This time, his eyes opened fully. He looked around slowly, then fixed his gaze on her. You're still here, he rasped. Yes, she said gently. You're stable now. Try to rest. He studied her face, as if memorizing it. Most people don't stay. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. After a moment, he spoke again. They think I'm nobody. Her hands paused mid-adjustment. People shouldn't assume. He gave a faint, humorless smile. They always do. Silence settled between them. Then he said quietly, I used to run hospitals like this. She blinked. You were, medical administration, he replied. Board level. She tried not to show her surprise. What happened? Life, he said simply. Wrong trust, wrong people. Lost everything. Then lost myself. As the morning light crept through the blinds, he asked her to bring his belongings. From a torn jacket pocket, he pulled out an old wallet. Inside was a faded ID and a business card bearing a name she recognized immediately, one mentioned in orientation sessions, tied to the hospital's early success. Her heart pounded. Later that morning, the department head arrived, followed by hospital administration. The atmosphere shifted, tense and formal. The man spoke calmly, without bitterness, describing the night, the delay, the words spoken about him when they thought he couldn't hear. I don't blame exhaustion, he said. I blame indifference. He turned his head toward the young nurse. She didn't see a vagrant. She saw a patient. No one argued. An internal review was announced. Protocols would be reinforced. Staff conduct addressed. The senior nurse was asked to step aside pending investigation. Her face was pale, her authority suddenly brittle. When they left, the man looked at the young nurse again. Thank you, he said. You reminded me why this place mattered once. She felt tears sting her eyes but held them back. When her shift finally ended, she walked outside into the cold morning air. The city was waking up, unaware of the small battle that had taken place overnight. She was exhausted. She was shaken. But she was certain of one thing. No matter how many times she was mocked, no matter how small she felt, she would never forget why she chose this profession. Every life deserved care. And sometimes, believing that was enough to change everything, the night shift had a way of stripping people down to their truest selves. By the time the ambulance screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance, the hospital corridors already felt heavy with fatigue, irritation, and that dull emotional numbness that crept in after too many hours under white lights. The stretcher burst through the automatic doors, wheels rattling loudly against the tiled floor. A blast of icy air followed it inside, carrying the sharp smell of snow, sweat, and unwashed clothes. On the stretcher lay a man wrapped in a stained blanket, his body thin, almost swallowed by layers of worn fabric. His face was bruised, one cheek swollen badly, his beard matted with dried blood. Found near the railway underpass, one of the paramedics said briskly. Unconscious. Possible head trauma. Hypothermia. Vitals unstable. The senior nurse glanced up from the desk, her eyes scanning the patient for barely a second before her mouth twisted in irritation. Of course, she said. Another one from the street. She turned toward the youngest nurse on duty, a girl who still flinched slightly whenever her name was called too sharply. Her uniform looked too new, the fabric stiff, her badge gleaming as if it didn't belong in this place yet. They brought in a vagrant, the senior nurse said loudly enough for others to hear. Go practice. A couple of staff members snorted quietly. Someone shook their head as if the night had just gotten longer for no good reason. The young nurse felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Practice. On a human being. On someone everyone else had already decided didn't matter. She nodded, forcing her feet to move. As she approached the stretcher, she shut out the laughter behind her. She focused on the man's face, on the uneven rise of his chest, on the monitor that refused to settle into a reassuring rhythm. She slipped on gloves, her hands steady despite the heat crawling up her neck. His skin was cold, too cold. When she checked his pulse, it fluttered weakly beneath her fingers like it might disappear. If she pressed too hard. She leaned closer, listening to his breathing, counting silently, noticing the faint wheeze on each exhale. She lifted his eyelids gently. One pupil reacted sluggishly to the light. Her chest tightened. She straightened and reported calmly, unequal pupils. Low blood pressure. He needs imaging and labs as soon as possible. The senior nurse waved her off without looking. He's probably drunk. They always are. Do the basics and don't waste resources. The young nurse opened her mouth, then closed it again. Arguing now would only delay care. She turned back to the patient, jaw clenched, and began working. She cleaned his wounds carefully, wiping away blood and grime with slow, deliberate movements. Beneath the dirt, his skin was pale, almost translucent. There was nothing careless about her touch. She adjusted the oxygen mask, checked the IV line, documented everything precisely. Her instructors' voices echoed in her mind, reminding her that assumptions were dangerous, that patterns didn't save lives, attention did. Time passed unevenly, stretching and compressing in the strange way it always did during night shifts. The monitor beeped, hesitated, beeped again. Then the pattern changed. She looked up sharply. Oxygen saturation was dropping. She checked again, hoping she'd misread it. She hadn't. His condition is deteriorating, she said, louder now. We need a doctor. The senior nurse sighed dramatically. You're nervous. That's normal for beginners. The young nurse didn't answer. She stepped closer to the bed, watching the man's face. His brow twitched, his fingers curling weakly as if he were trying to hold on to something. His eyes fluttered open for a brief moment. They weren't glassy or unfocused like she'd expected. They were clear, aware, confused. His lips moved. Then the monitor screamed. She reacted without thinking. The emergency button was pressed. Her hands moved exactly as they had in training, but this wasn't a simulation. This was warm skin, real blood, a life slipping fast. Code blue. Someone shouted. The room flooded with people. A doctor rushed in, snapping orders. Equipment clattered. The air grew thick with urgency. Who was with him? The doctor asked sharply. I was, the young nurse said, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. What happened? He crashed. I warned. Later, the doctor cut in. Now, they worked hard, relentlessly. The young nurse assisted, anticipating needs, passing instruments, adjusting lines. Sweat dampened her collar, but she didn't notice. All she saw was the monitor, the man's chest, the doctor's hands moving fast. Seconds dragged, then minutes. Finally, the monitor stabilized into a fragile but steady rhythm. The room fell quiet except for the soft hum of machines. The doctor stepped back, exhaling slowly. That was close. Later, after the adrenaline drained away, the scans came back. The doctor studied them, jaw tightening. Internal bleeding, he said. Head trauma. If we'd waited any longer, he'd be dead. No one spoke. The senior nurse avoided everyone's eyes. The man was moved to a monitored room. The young nurse asked to stay with him. This time, no one objected. The night stretched on. She checked vitals regularly, adjusted fluids, documented every change. Her legs ached, her eyes burned, but she didn't leave. There was something about this patient that held her attention, something beyond professional duty. Near dawn, the man stirred again. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on the ceiling before drifting toward her. You're still here, he said hoarsely. Yes, she replied softly. You're stable now. Try to rest. He studied her face as if committing it to memory. Most people walk away. She swallowed. I couldn't. A faint smile tugged at his lips. They called me a vagrant, didn't they? She hesitated, then nodded. Some people made assumptions. He closed his eyes briefly. They always do. There was a long silence before he spoke again. I used to sit in rooms like this, he said quietly. Just on the other side of the table. She blinked. You worked in healthcare administration, he said. Hospitals, clinics, oversaw budgets, staff, expansions. He laughed softly, without humor. Funny how fast titles disappear. What happened? She asked gently. I trusted the wrong people, he replied. Lost my position. Then my family. Then my home. After a while, surviving became the only job I had left. Later, he asked her to bring his belongings. From the pocket of his jacket, he pulled out an old wallet. Inside was a faded ID and a business card. The name on it made her heart skip. She recognized it instantly. That morning, when hospital management arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Voices dropped. Postures straightened. The man spoke calmly, describing the night, the dismissive comments, the delay. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. I don't want apologies, he said. I want this place to remember why it exists. Then he turned his gaze toward the young nurse. She did. The senior nurse stood rigid, her authority evaporating under the weight of the moment. An internal review was announced. Protocols would be reinforced. Conduct addressed. The words were formal, measured, but their meaning was clear. When the room emptied, the man looked at the young nurse again. You didn't see a homeless man, he said. You saw a patient. Don't ever lose that. Tears burned her eyes, but she smiled. I won't. When her shift ended, she stepped outside into the pale morning light. The city was waking up, unaware of what had unfolded in the quiet hours before dawn. She was exhausted. She was shaken. But she felt something solid settle inside her. No matter how many times she was mocked. No matter how small she was made to feel. She knew now, without doubt, that compassion wasn't weakness. It was the reason she belonged here.